My name is Loretta. I am 62 years old, and my occupation is a retired nurse's aide and night dispatcher. I spent 30 years working double shifts, breaking my back on the hospital floor all morning, and answering emergency calls all night just to keep a roof over our heads. My only goal in this life was to put my son Jamal through business school and give him the life he deserved. The love I had for my boy was undeniable. We were a team fighting against the world together. I remember rubbing my swollen feet at 3 a.m, looking at him sleeping at the kitchen table with his textbooks open and feeling nothing but absolute pride. I thought we had an unbreakable bond built on all those years of sacrifice and survival. I truly broke my back working double shifts to give my son the life he deserved. Now he looks right through me like I am a completely worthless stranger. For the longest time, I blamed myself for the distance growing between us. I thought maybe I had not done enough. Or maybe I was just an old woman who did not fit into his shiny new corporate world. I blamed myself, right up until the night I found out exactly who poisoned his mind. The realization happened on a crisp Friday evening. We were supposed to be celebrating a massive milestone. Jamal had just been named senior partner at his firm, an achievement I had prayed for since he first put on a graduation gown. I spent 2 weeks of my pension just to buy a beautiful plum-colored dress for the occasion and wanting to look like a mother he could be proud of. The restaurant was one of those high-end downtown places with velvet chairs and waiters who whisper when they speak. I arrived early, my heart full of joy, holding a small gift box with a watch I had saved up to buy for him. When Jamal finally walked through those grand glass doors with his wife Chloe, my heart leapt. I stood up, smoothing down my dress, ready to embrace the son I sacrificed my youth for. But Jamal did not even look my way. He walked right past me. His eyes locked on Chloe's parents who were standing near the bar. He hugged them warmly, laughing and thanking them for coming, while I stood there, feeling completely invisible. A hostess eventually approached me with a tight, apologetic smile and guided me to my seat. I was not placed at the grand center table with Jamal, Chloe, and her family. Instead, I was escorted to a small, cramped table shoved in the back corner, right next to the swinging doors of the kitchen. I sat there alone, sipping a glass of water, watching the waiters rush past me with trays of expensive food. I watched my son raise a glass of champagne with his new family, acting as if the woman who wiped his tears and paid his tuition did not exist. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, telling myself he was just busy hosting. But then Chloe and her brother Todd walked past my table toward the restrooms, completely unaware that I was sitting in the shadows of the corner booth. Todd is a slick-talking white American who always carried himself like he owned the entire world, despite constantly asking Jamal for business favors. They stopped just a few feet away from me, and the noise from the kitchen doors masked my presence. I heard Todd laugh a sharp, arrogant sound before he lowered his voice. "Did you get the old lady to sign the papers yet?" he asked Chloe. "Once her house is collateral, Jamal's new startup investment is fully funded, and we can finally stick her in that state-run facility downtown. I cannot stand her showing up at your house anymore." Chloe let out a soft, mocking giggle. "Relax, Todd," she said. "Jamal is handling it. He already believes her memory is fading. One more push, and he will get her to sign the equity over. She will be out of our hair by the holidays." My blood ran ice cold. The heavy glass of water I was holding nearly slipped from my fingers. I could not breathe. My own house, the only thing I owned free and clear, was being targeted as collateral. And my son, my beautiful boy, was actually listening to them. The distance, the ignored phone calls, the missed Sunday dinners, none of it was an accident. It was a carefully calculated plot to strip me of my dignity, my home, and my freedom. I sat frozen in that dimly lit corner of the restaurant, gripping my glass of ice water so tightly my knuckles turned white. The noise of the clinking silverware and the laughter from the main dining room faded into a dull, ringing hum in my ears. As I watched Chloe and Todd walk back to the table where my son was sitting, my mind immediately snapped back to the days when Jamal and I had nothing but each other. Raising a black boy alone in this world is a terrifying, beautiful responsibility, and I took it on with every ounce of strength I had in my body. I spent my mornings lifting patients twice my size, smelling of hospital bleach, and rubbing alcohol, smiling through the sharp, shooting aches in my lower back. Then I would rush home, throw a hot home-cooked meal on the table for Jamal, kiss his forehead, and head straight to the dispatch center to work the night shift. I lived on cold coffee leftover scraps and maybe 4 hours of sleep a night for over a decade. I remember one bitter winter the soles of my white nursing shoes had worn completely through. I lined the inside of those shoes with thick pieces of cardboard, just so I could afford to buy those expensive basketball sneakers Jamal needed for varsity tryouts. I wore those cardboard-lined shoes for 6 months, so I could buy him that shiny new laptop he begged for when he first started business school. I never complained to him, not a single time. When you are a mother, your children's dreams become your own, and you will gladly walk on bare concrete to see them fly. Jamal used to know that. He used to appreciate every single drop of sweat I poured into his future. I will never forget the night he got his first big job offer. We sat on the worn-out sofa in our living room crying tears of pure joy and relief. He held my tired, calloused hands in his, looked me right in the eyes, and made a promise I kept locked away in my heart for years. He said, "Mama, when I make it, you will never have to work another day in your life. I am going to buy you a house with a wraparound porch and a beautiful garden, and you will just rest." That was the boy I raised, a boy with a heart full of deep gratitude and fierce love, a boy who saw my bleeding hands and promised to make them mean something. But watching him sit there laughing with the very people who were planning to lock me away and steal my home, I realized that sweet, grateful boy had been gone for a very long time. The change in my son did not happen overnight. It crept into our lives like a slow, silent poison, starting the very day he brought Chloe home. At first, she played her part flawlessly. She would sit right at my kitchen table, smiling that sweet, practiced smile, complimenting my cooking and telling me how incredibly lucky she was to find a man raised by such a strong, dedicated woman. She called me Mama Loretta and brought me little gifts, making me believe she truly wanted to be part of our family. But the moment the ink dried on their marriage license, the heavy mask slipped right off her face. Chloe stopped calling me Mama Loretta and started calling me by my first name, using a sharp, clipped tone that felt much more like a reprimand than a greeting. Then, she brought her older brother Todd into the mix. Todd was a smooth-talking, arrogant man who wore custom suits that cost more than my entire retirement account. He inserted himself into Jamal's life as a so-called business partner, though I never once saw him do an honest day's work. Todd made my skin crawl from the very first day he stepped onto my front porch. He looked around my neighborhood, a proud working-class community filled with good, honest people who looked out for one another. And he actually wrinkled his nose like he had just stepped in raw garbage. He made snide, disrespectful comments about the crime rate and asked Jamal how he ever survived growing up in such a bleak, depressing place. Jamal, who used to defend our home and our people with fierce, unwavering pride, just chuckled uncomfortably, looked down at his shoes and agreed with him. That was the first real crack in my heart. From there, the isolation became deliberate, calculated and suffocating. Our sacred Sunday dinners, a tradition Jamal and I held tightly for 25 years, were suddenly treated like a massive burden. Chloe would cancel at the last minute, claiming she preferred to host her own family, or that Todd had arranged a high-profile networking dinner they simply could not miss. Weeks turned into months between visits. When I did try to be a part of their lives, I was intentionally pushed to the margins. I remember going to their massive new house for Thanksgiving last year. I had spent 2 whole days cooking Jamal's absolute favorite dishes: packing them up carefully in the back of my car. When I arrived, Chloe took the food from my hands, transferred it into her own expensive serving dishes, and never once told her wealthy guests that I had cooked it. She actually had me sitting in the kitchen for half the evening, asking me to keep an eye on the oven and clear the dirty appetizer plates, treating me exactly like the hired help, rather than the matriarch of the family. Todd would stroll through the kitchen, pour himself a top-shelf drink, and ask me to fetch him extra ice without even making eye contact with me. He spoke to me like I was something scraped off the bottom of his shoe. And Jamal was too busy entertaining his new high society friends in the living room to notice his mother being treated like a servant in the shadows. I justified their behavior for a very long time. I told myself that they were just young and ambitious, trying desperately to navigate their new corporate circles. I told myself that mothers have to let their sons spread their wings, even if it means watching them soar completely away from the nest. I swallowed my heavy pride, bit my tongue until it bled, and smiled through the blatant disrespect, because I loved my son more than I loved myself. I wanted him to be successful and happy, even if his picture-perfect happiness no longer included me. But sitting alone in that restaurant booth, hearing Todd and Chloe literally map out my financial and mental destruction, while my son sat happily just a few tables away, the heavy blinders finally fell from my eyes. They had not just drifted away naturally due to busy schedules. They had deliberately pushed me out of the boat, and now they were actively holding my head under the water, trying to drown me. I did not sleep a single wink that night. I sat at my kitchen table, gripping a mug of cold tea, staring at the walls of the house I had worked my entire life to pay off. This was the house where I had measured Jamal's height on the hallway doorframe, where I had cooked 1,000 Sunday dinners, where I had fallen asleep in my work uniform, just to wake up and do it all over again. Todd's arrogant voice kept echoing in my head like a scratched record. Once her house is collateral, we can finally stick her in that state-run facility downtown. The very idea that they thought I was some helpless, clueless old woman they could just throw away filled me with a sickening kind of dread. But I knew I could not just sit there feeling sorry for myself. I had to know exactly what kind of paper Todd was talking about. The next morning, I put on my best church suit, grabbed my purse, and marched straight down to the First National Bank branch on the corner. Jamal and I still had a small joint savings account from his college days. I never touched the money in it, always leaving it there for emergencies, but my name was still legally on the file. I walked into the branch and sat right down at the desk of Mr. Henderson, the branch manager, who had known me for 20 years. He was the man who helped me open my very first savings account when I was just a young, exhausted nurse working night shifts. I asked him to pull up every single document, every loan and every account attached to my name and my home address. Mr. Henderson smiled warmly at first, but as he typed on his keyboard for what felt like an absolute eternity, his brow furrowed deeper and deeper. The colour slowly drained from his face. He took off his glasses and looked at me with an expression of sheer, agonizing pity. "Loretta," he said softly, his voice full of concern. "When exactly did you take out a reverse mortgage on your home?" My heart stopped beating in my chest. The air left the room entirely. I stared at him and told him clearly that I owned my home free and clear. I had paid off the final mortgage payment 5 years ago and held the deed in my own safe. Mr. Henderson slowly turned his computer screen toward me. There it was in black and white. A massive lien against my property for $250,000. Someone had forged my signature on a thick stack of loan documents, completely draining the equity I had spent 30 years breaking my back to build. And the funds had not just vanished into thin air. They had been wired directly into an account managed by Todd's so-called investment firm. Todd and Chloe had quite literally stolen the roof right over my head. But the nightmare did not end there. While Mr. Henderson was digging through the system, I asked him to look into the joint college account I shared with Jamal. I needed to see if they had touched that money too. What Mr. Henderson printed out for me made my stomach turn completely inside out. Over the last 2 years, massive amounts of money had been transferred out of Jamal's personal corporate accounts and funneled directly through our joint savings account. But the outgoing transfers were labelled with titles that made absolutely no sense to me. Riverboat Casino, Platinum Slots, Vegas 5, IP. I stared at the paper completely paralysed. Todd and Chloe had been stealing Jamal's hard-earned money to fund their own lavish lifestyle and pay off Todd's massive personal debts. But they had purposefully routed the transactions through my name to make it look like they were paying off my massive gambling debts. They had meticulously fabricated a digital paper trail painting me as a degenerate gambler who was bleeding her own son dry. Suddenly, every cold stare, every cancelled Sunday dinner, every look of sheer disgust Jamal had given me over the past 2 years made perfect, agonizing sense. My son did not push me away because I was just an old woman who did not fit into his high society world. He pushed me away because his wife and her slick-talking brother had convinced him that I was stealing the food right out of his mouth to feed a sick, relentless addiction. They had poisoned my boy's mind against me turning the son I sacrificed my youth for into a man who looked at me with pure contempt. I sat in that leather chair at the bank, feeling the absolute weight of their betrayal trying to crush me into the floor. They wanted to steal my home, destroy my relationship with my son, and lock me away in a facility where no one would ever listen to my side of the story. But I did not cry. Crying was for women who had given up. I thanked Mr. Henderson, gathered every single printed copy of the fraud, and walked out of those glass doors with a heart made of solid stone. I drove straight from the bank to Jamal's neighborhood. The steering wheel of my old sedan felt like ice under my grip. I was practically vibrating with a mix of fury and profound heartbreak. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how I was going to look my son in the eye and explain the massive web of lies his wife and brother-in-law had spun around him. I pulled up to their massive 2-story house in that pristine gated community, a house I had essentially subsidized with my own sweat and blood. I marched up the paved driveway, my low-heeled shoes clicking against the stone, ready to demand answers from my boy. I pressed the glowing doorbell, fully expecting Jamal to answer. I could hear the faint sound of a television playing inside. But when the heavy mahogany door swung open, it was not my son standing there. It was Chloe. She was holding a glass of white wine, wearing a silk robe, and the moment she saw me standing on her welcome mat, that sickeningly sweet smile she usually wore completely vanished. The mask fell off so fast it made my head spin. Her eyes hardened into 2 cold, calculating stones. I asked to see Jamal. I told her I needed to speak to my son immediately about a serious issue with the bank. Chloe did not even budge. She leaned against the doorframe, physically blocking my entry, and took a slow sip of her wine. "He does not want to see a thief, Loretta," she said, her voice dripping with pure venom. The sound of my first name coming out of her mouth felt like a physical blow. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust. "Todd is managing our finances now," she continued, her tone sharp and completely unapologetic. "We know exactly what you have been doing. We know you have been draining Jamal's accounts to feed your sick gambling habit. And quite frankly, Jamal is too heartbroken and disgusted to even look at you right now." I tried to speak, tried to tell her that she was a liar, but she cut me right off. She leaned in closer, dropping her voice to a harsh, threatening whisper. "Here is how this is going to work," she hissed. "You are going to sign over the remaining equity of that rundown house quietly. You will pack your bags and go exactly where we tell you to go. If you make a scene, or if you try to contact Jamal, Todd will press criminal charges against you for stealing from your own son. We have the bank statements to prove it, Loretta. You will rot in a jail cell before you ever see a courtroom." The sheer audacity of her threat paralyzed me. My chest tightened so hard I could barely draw a breath. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake her and tell her I had literal proof of Todd forging my signature. I felt the hot, stinging prick of tears rushing to my eyes as the reality of my situation crashed down on me. They had completely brainwashed my beautiful boy. They had isolated him, drained him, and painted me as the ultimate villain. But as that first tear threatened to fall, a deep, ancient survival instinct flared up inside my soul. I realized in that exact moment that crying would not save my house. Crying would not save my son. Showing my hand right now would only give these vultures the chance to destroy the evidence and finish me off. So I swallowed my tears. I let my shoulders slump forward, forcing my hands to tremble just a little bit. I looked down at my worn-out shoes, playing the exact role she expected me to play. I became the defeated, broken, confused old woman she thought she had conquered. "You cannot just throw me out on the street, Chloe," I whispered, making my voice sound incredibly weak and frail. "I have nowhere else to go. Please, I just need a little time. Just give me a few days to gather my things and say goodbye to my home." Chloe smirked a cruel, triumphant curve of her lips. "You have until Friday, Loretta," she sneered. "Do not make us come over there and pack for you." She slammed the heavy wooden door right in my face. I stood on that porch for a few seconds, staring at the brass numbers on the door. But as I turned and walked back to my car, my tears completely dried up. I was not a confused old lady, and I was certainly not defeated. They wanted a war, and they had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. The harassment did not stop with that slammed door. It seeped into my daily life like a toxic gas, suffocating me in the very home I had scrubbed, painted, and prayed over for 3 decades. My phone rang constantly. It was never my son. It was always Todd. He would leave long, slow voicemails speaking to me with the exaggerated patience you might use on a toddler. He told me to start packing. He told me to throw away my old junk because the facility only allowed 1 suitcase. Every time the phone buzzed, my heart hammered against my ribs. I felt like a prisoner in my own sanctuary, the house I bought with 30 years of lifting heavy patients and working grueling night shifts at the dispatch center. By Wednesday morning, the psychological warfare turned into a physical invasion. I was in the kitchen washing my coffee mug when I heard the distinct sound of a key turning in my front door. I froze. I had given Jamal an emergency key years ago, trusting him completely. Now that trust was being weaponized against me. The heavy door swung open without a single knock. Todd strolled right into my living room, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit and expensive leather loafers, completely tracking dirt onto the hardwood floors I had polished the night before. He was not alone. Right behind him was a scruffy-looking man holding a clipboard and a laser measuring tape. The man did not introduce himself. He did not even look at me. He just started pointing his red laser at my walls, scribbling numbers onto his clipboard, like my home was already an empty, abandoned construction site. I stepped out of the kitchen, wiping my damp hands on my apron. I demanded to know what they were doing walking into my home without my permission. Todd simply smirked, leaning against the archway of the dining room, as if he had paid the mortgage himself. "We are just getting a head start on the appraisal," Loretta Todd said, crossing his arms. His voice was smooth and utterly dismissive. "Once you are out of here by the end of the week, Jamal wants to gut this entire floor. We are going to knock down that load-bearing wall, put in an open-concept kitchen, and flip this property for double its current value. The neighborhood is gentrifying, and we cannot afford to let this asset sit around smelling like old potpourri and regret." My chest heaved. I watched this entitled, arrogant white man casually plan the destruction of the very walls that had sheltered my black son when the rest of the world was cruel to him. This was the living room where I had stayed up all night helping Jamal with his college applications. This was the kitchen where I had stretched a single chicken to feed us for a week. And Todd was standing there, pointing at my life like it was a cheap teardown project. I told Todd to get out. I told him he had no right to bring a stranger into my house. Todd let out a dry, condescending laugh. He signaled the appraiser to go check the backyard, waiting until the heavy glass sliding door clicked shut before he turned his full attention back to me. His smirk faded, replaced by a cold, hard glare that made my blood run cold. He closed the distance between us, stepping right into my personal space, towering over me. "You really do not get it, do you?" Todd whispered, his voice dripping with pure malice. "You do not have any rights anymore. Your son gave me full authority to handle this transition because he cannot bear to look at the woman who gambled away his emergency funds." I stared up at him, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. Todd leaned in even closer. I could smell his strong, expensive cologne, masking the rot of his lies. "You have until Friday morning to have your bags packed," he commanded. "If you are not sitting on that porch, ready to go by 9 o'clock, I will bring the authorities. I will show them the bank statements proving you have bled your son dry at the riverboat casinos. I will tell them you are suffering from severe aggressive dementia, and that you are a physical danger to yourself." He paused, letting the heavy threat hang in the quiet air of my kitchen. "They will forcibly remove you, Loretta. I already have a bed picked out for you in a state-run psychiatric ward downtown. It is not pretty. It smells like bleach and despair, and the nurses there do not care about your stories. You will be locked in a small room, and absolutely no one will ever believe a word you say, because you will just be another crazy, broke old woman who lost her mind. So do we have an understanding? Or do I need to make that phone call right now?" For one terrifying second, absolute panic gripped my throat. I pictured the harsh fluorescent lights of a state ward. I pictured being locked away, stripped of my freedom, silenced forever by a man who was using my own son's name to destroy me. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to slap him or throw a plate at his head. He was waiting for a reaction he could record and use as proof that I was unstable. But Todd made one massive miscalculation. He forgot what I did for a living for 30 years. I was a night dispatcher. I spent decades sitting in a dark room, answering frantic emergency calls, listening to people screaming, bleeding, and begging for their lives. I was trained to remain completely stone cold in the face of absolute chaos. Panic was a luxury I could not afford then, and I certainly could not afford it now. The frantic pounding in my chest slowly settled into a deep, icy rhythm. I looked at the smug, punchable face of the man trying to steal my life, and a profound, beautiful clarity washed over my entire soul. Crying was over. Begging was over. It was time to play the game. I let my shoulders slump forward, perfectly mimicking the posture of a defeated, terrified old woman. I cast my eyes downward, making my lower lip tremble just a little. "You win, Todd," I whispered, making my voice crack perfectly. "Please do not call the authorities. I will be ready on Friday. I do not want any trouble. I will sign whatever you need." Todd smiled, a wide, victorious grin that showed all his teeth. "Good choice, Loretta." He chuckled, patting my kitchen counter like a master praising a beaten dog. "Now, be a good host. I have been dealing with your son's mess all morning. Do you have any of that sweet tea you are always pushing on us?" I nodded meekly. I walked over to the refrigerator, pulled out the glass pitcher, and poured him a tall glass of sweet tea. I added 2 ice cubes, listening to them clink against the glass. I walked back over and handed it to him with a polite, frail smile. He took a long drink, completely satisfied with his apparent victory, looking around my kitchen like he was already counting the cash from the sale. But as I stood there, hiding my hands inside the deep pockets of my apron, my fingers were not trembling at all. They were perfectly, remarkably steady. Todd thought he had broken me. He thought he had backed an old, helpless woman into a corner. But as he drank my tea in my kitchen, He had no idea he had just declared war on a woman who had spent her entire life fighting and winning. The tears were gone. The heartbreak was replaced by pure, calculated strategy. The war was officially on, and I was going to burn his entire world to the ground. I did not just hire a lawyer, I hired a shark. And more importantly, I hired a forensic accountant. You see, when you work night dispatch for decades, you learn a thing or two about keeping a secret stash for emergencies. Jamal thought he knew everything about my finances. He thought the little joint savings account was all I had left. He and Chloe had completely overlooked the state pension and the secondary retirement fund I had quietly built from my dispatcher days. It was a completely separate account I started when Jamal was just a teenager. Every time I worked a holiday or pulled a double shift, I put a little piece of that overtime into this hidden fund. I never told Jamal about it, because a smart woman always keeps a safety net that no one else can touch. That hidden money became my weapon. I sat in a high-rise office downtown, looking across a polished glass table at Mr. Sterling, a forensic accountant who had a reputation for tearing apart financial frauds. I handed him the reverse mortgage documents, the joint account statements, and every piece of mail I had intercepted. I told him to follow the money. I paid his exorbitant retainer in full and told him I needed everything he could find before Friday. For 3 days, I played the role of the broken old woman perfectly. I packed boxes, slowly leaving them around the living room. I answered Todd's harassing phone calls with a trembling voice, telling him I was getting my affairs in order. But behind the scenes, Mr. Sterling was tearing their entire financial world wide open. When he called me back into his office on Thursday afternoon, the truth he laid out on the table was more twisted than I ever could have imagined. Todd was not a venture capitalist. He was not a successful business partner. He was a degenerate gambler with debts that would make a sane person physically ill. Mr. Sterling traced the $250,000 from the forged reverse mortgage on my house directly into an offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. That company was controlled exclusively by Todd. But Todd had not acted alone. Chloe was completely in on it. She was the one who forged my signature on the mortgage documents, using her status as Jamal's wife to bypass the standard banking security checks. The money they had been draining from Jamal's startup investment funds was not going toward any new software or business development. It was going straight into that same shell company. Chloe was siphoning her own husband's hard-earned wealth to cover her brother's massive gambling losses and to fund her daily shopping sprees at high-end boutiques. They had been bleeding Jamal dry for 2 years, and when the well started to run dry, they set their sights on the only other asset they could find, which was my house. But they needed a cover story. They needed a reason for all that missing cash, just in case Jamal ever asked an accountant to look closely at the books. So they created a sick, twisted lie. They fabricated bank statements, making it look like I had a severe gambling addiction. They doctored records to show that I was the one spending nights at riverboat casinos, draining Jamal's emergency funds to feed a relentless sickness. They fed this poison to my son, convincing him that his own mother was stealing the food out of his mouth. They told him my mind was deteriorating, that my addiction had completely consumed my morality, and that putting me in a state-run facility was an act of mercy to stop me from ruining his life completely. That was why Jamal looked at me with such absolute disgust at the restaurant. He believed them. He believed the woman he shared a bed with and the brother-in-law he trusted implicitly. They had painted me as a monster and played the role of the devoted family trying to manage a tragic situation, sitting in the accountant's office holding the undeniable proof of their crimes. I felt a rage so cold and pure it completely crystallized my soul. They wanted to destroy my mind and steal my home to cover up their own filthy sins. But they had left a massive paper trail, and now I held every single receipt. I invited them all over for a farewell dinner on Thursday night. I called Jamal and left a voicemail using that same frail, trembling voice I had perfected over the past few days. I told him I was ready to sign the final equity papers and that I had packed my bags for the facility. I asked if they could just come over for one last family meal in the house where he grew up. I knew they would not refuse. Todd would want to make sure I signed those papers before the banks opened on Friday morning. I spent the entire afternoon preparing the table. I did not cook a simple meal. I cooked a feast. I made smothered pork chops, collard greens, macaroni and cheese, and candied yams. I baked the peach cobbler Jamal used to beg for when he got a good grade in middle school. I set the dining room table with my finest plates, the ones I only brought out for Thanksgiving and Christmas. I polished the silverware until it shined and placed a tall pitcher of sweet tea right in the center. I wanted the house to smell like love. I wanted it to smell like the home they were trying to steal. When the doorbell rang at 7 o'clock, I smoothed my apron and opened the door. Todd walked in first, stepping over the threshold with that familiar, arrogant swagger. He was wearing a sharp grey suit, looking around the living room at the packed boxes I had strategically placed near the door. He smiled a cruel, satisfied grin and patted the breast pocket of his jacket, where I knew he was keeping his expensive gold pen ready for me to sign my life away. Chloe followed closely behind him, holding her designer handbag tightly, pretending to look sympathetic, while her eyes scanned the room for anything else she could pawn. And then came Jamal. My son walked into his childhood home looking absolutely exhausted. He could not even look me in the eye. He stared at the floorboards, shifting his weight uncomfortably. His shoulders were slumped, carrying the heavy guilt of a man who believed he was doing something terrible but necessary. "Please come in and sit down," I said softly, gesturing toward the dining room. I made all of Jamal's favorites. Todd let out a small, amused chuckle, pulling out a chair for Chloe before sitting down himself. "Well, Loretta, this is a very nice gesture," he said smoothly, unfolding a linen napkin and placing it on his lap. "It is good to see you being so cooperative. It makes this difficult transition much easier for everyone, especially Jamal." Jamal flinched at the sound of his name, but remained silent, staring down at his empty porcelain plate. Chloe reached out and placed her manicured hand over Jamal's, faking a look of deep sorrow. "We just want what is best for you, Loretta," she murmured, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "The facility has wonderful doctors. You will finally get the help you need for your condition." I smiled politely at her. I offered Todd a glass of sweet tea and poured it for him, watching the ice clink against the glass. I served the smothered pork chops, placing a generous portion on Jamal's plate. I moved around the table, playing the perfect, gracious host, serving the people who had planned my absolute destruction. But underneath the table, my hands were completely steady. The trembling was gone. The frailty was a costume I was ready to shed. I took my seat at the head of the table, the position of the matriarch, the position I had earned through 30 years of blood, sweat, and tears. Todd cleared his throat, reaching into his suit jacket. He pulled out the thick stack of legal documents and that heavy gold pen, placing them right next to my plate of macaroni and cheese. "Dinner looks fantastic," Loretta Todd said, flashing his predatory smile. "But let us handle the business first. Once you sign these, we can all relax and enjoy the meal. Jamal has already arranged for the transport to pick you up first thing tomorrow morning." I looked at the papers. Then I looked at Todd. Then I looked at Chloe, who was taking a delicate sip of her water, watching me with eager anticipation. Finally, I looked at Jamal, my son, my flesh and blood. He was staring out the window, completely avoiding the scene playing out in front of him. I reached down, next to my chair, but I did not pick up the gold pen. Instead, I pulled up a thick, heavy manila folder and dropped it directly onto the center of the table with a loud, resounding thud that made the silverware rattle. Todd blinked in confusion. Chloe lowered her glass. Jamal finally turned to look at me. "Business first," I said, my voice no longer trembling. My tone was crisp, clear, and sharp as a razor. Yes, Todd, I completely agree. Let us handle the business first. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or flip the dinner table. I simply placed my hand on the thick manila folder and slid it slowly across the polished wood, directly toward Jamal. Todd scoffed, rolling his eyes, and asked what kind of desperate garbage this was. Chloe let out a long, exasperated sigh, telling Jamal that I was just stalling because I did not want to pack my bags. But I did not look at them. I kept my eyes locked on my son, and I calmly told him to open the folder and read the papers. Jamal hesitated for a second before flipping open the heavy cover. The very first page was the comprehensive forensic accounting summary prepared by my accountant. I sat in total silence, watching the color completely drain from Jamal's face. He looked like an absolute ghost as his eyes darted rapidly across the pages. He saw the exact wire transfers, proving that Todd had forged my signature on the reverse mortgage to steal my house. He saw the routing numbers leading straight from that loan into Todd's offshore shell company. He saw the undeniable proof that Todd was not investing in any business startup, but had been explicitly embezzling massive amounts of money to pay off his own aggressive gambling debts. Then Jamal flipped to the next section and found the printed emails. These were messages exchanged directly between Chloe and Todd, laughing together about how incredibly easy it was to fabricate those fake bank statements. The emails outlined their exact scheme to frame me for a severe gambling addiction, so Jamal would look at me with disgust and force me into a state-run psychiatric ward. Chloe had written detailed messages about using the rest of the stolen money to fund her lavish lifestyle and expensive shopping sprees. Jamal started shaking uncontrollably. He looked up at Chloe, his voice cracking as he asked her what all of this meant. Chloe's smug smirk instantly vanished. She started stammering, looking frantically at Todd for some kind of help. Todd's face turned bright red with pure fury. He slammed his hands hard on the dining room table, knocking over his glass of sweet tea, and lunged forward, trying to snatch the folder away from Jamal. He yelled that the documents were completely forged and that I was just a crazy, sick old woman making things up to ruin their perfect lives. Right as Todd's fingers grazed the edge of the paper, the doorbell rang. It was a sharp, piercing sound that froze everyone in the room. I calmly stood up, smoothed my apron, and walked to the front door. I opened it wide. Standing on my porch was my lawyer, accompanied by two serious-looking police detectives. They stepped right into my home, their heavy boots loud against the hardwood floor. Todd tried to bolt toward the back kitchen door, but one of the detectives was much faster. They grabbed Todd right there in my dining room, pressing him hard against the wall next to the feast I had prepared. The detective read him his rights, loudly declaring that he was being placed under arrest for wire fraud and elder financial abuse. Todd was screaming and struggling against the heavy metal handcuffs, demanding that Chloe do something to help him. Meanwhile, my lawyer stepped forward and handed Chloe a formal legal notice. Chloe completely lost her mind. As the detectives hauled her brother toward the front door, she started screaming hysterically. She grabbed Jamal's arm, begging him to stop the police, to defend her brother, and to fix this massive misunderstanding. She cried and pleaded, swearing that my documents were lies. But Jamal finally saw the absolute truth. He looked at the woman he had married, the woman who had ruthlessly plotted to destroy the mother who gave him everything. He gently but firmly peeled her perfectly manicured fingers right off his arm. He told her to get out of his house and never speak to him again. He kicked her out right then and there, leaving her sobbing on the front lawn. I found out later that Jamal filed for divorce the very next morning, freezing all their joint accounts before she could steal another single dime to fund her lavish lifestyle. Once the police cars drove away and Chloe ran down the street, my house fell completely silent. Jamal stood in the middle of the dining room, looking at the feast I had cooked for him and the empty cardboard boxes by the door. Then my big, strong, successful son fell straight to his knees. He buried his face in his hands and sobbed like a broken child. He begged for my forgiveness over and over again. He cried apologizing for believing the vicious lies of strangers over the mother who had broken her back, ruined her knees, and worn cardboard in her shoes just to give him a future. A mother's heart is a complex and beautiful thing. I looked down at my boy, the boy I loved more than life itself, and I forgave him. I forgave him because a mother's heart always does. But I did not bend down to pick him up off the floor. I set a firm, unyielding boundary. I told Jamal that I loved him, but he would have to earn his way back into my life, step by step and day by day. I kept my house free and clear. I kept my peace of mind. And most importantly, I kept my absolute dignity. Looking back on everything that happened, I realize now that the hardest battles we fight are not always against strangers. Sometimes the most vicious wars are waged right inside our own living rooms, sitting across the dinner table from the very people we love the most. I spent 30 years breaking my back, lifting patients, answering dispatch calls in the dead of night, and sacrificing every ounce of my youth. I did it all because I believed that pouring my entire soul into my son would guarantee a bond that nothing could ever break. But I had to learn a very painful truth. Family is not just about blood, honey. It is about respect. It is about honoring the sacrifices made for you and cherishing the hands that fed you when you had absolutely nothing. And you never ever let anyone, not a slick talking in-law, and not even the child you birthed, make you feel like you are disposable. You do not let them treat you like a stepping stone, or an old piece of furniture that they can just toss away when it no longer fits their shiny new aesthetic. I had to hit absolute rock bottom and look betrayal right in the eyes to finally understand my own true worth. I thought my purpose was just to be my son's mother, to be his silent provider forever. But I am Loretta. I am a fierce, independent woman who survived the absolute worst this cold world had to throw at me, and I did not survive all of that just to let a greedy little girl and her crooked brother steal my peace. You have to be willing to walk away from anyone who costs you your dignity. True love protects you. It never tries to destroy you. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever had to stand your ground and fight for the respect you deserve, I really want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is in your city right now. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with a strong woman who needs to hear this today. We have to remind each other of our strength, because this world will absolutely try to test it at every single turn. It is incredibly important to build a community where we uplift one another and share our truths without fear or shame. Your voice matters, your story matters, and your dignity is something you must fiercely protect against anyone who tries to take it away. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my personal journey. I truly hope it brings you the courage to face whatever battles you might be fighting in your own life. Remember that your worth is never determined by how others choose to treat you. So until next time, stay blessed, hold your head up high, and stay fierce.